afternoon, everyone. Again, please continue eating, but for now, we're going to get the speaker portion of our program started. So I would like to call up our President, Kate Daniels, to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Nicole. I am really looking forward to today. Thank you all for coming. This is one of my favorite luncheons of the year, and it is probably my favorite luncheon of the year because we get to learn so much, but it's also because we're here and we have the opportunity to hear from our senator and our assembly member. And if you're anything like me, there's mornings where you wake up and you think to yourself, wow, I'm so lucky that I have the representation that I have in Sacramento. It's not like that for a lot of people. You don't get the opportunity to wake up and know that your vision, your values, what you believe in, that we have two representatives that are actively fighting for what we believe in. And there's so many reasons that you see people enter public office, but I know down to my very core that Mark Stone and Bill Monning are doing this because they believe there's an opportunity to create change, and the time that they've spent in Sacramento, they've been doing just that. So thank you all for coming and joining us today for this opportunity to hear from our fabulous representatives. So what I'm going to do, and what I think we'll do is we'll have Bill speak first, and then we'll have Mark speak, and we'll do it for about 15 minutes each. And then at 1 o'clock, we'll have the opportunity to do Q&A with both of them. And so why don't we get right to it. I'm going to introduce Bill, who first was elected to the Assembly in 2008. His district includes all of San Luis Obispo and Santa Cruz counties and portions of Monterey and Santa Clara counties. He is not only one of the most thoughtful and effective leaders I've known, I think he's probably one of the coolest cats in Sacramento. If you follow him on Facebook, you'll know exactly why I'm saying that. He is really, really cool, and I really love Bill. So, although we have 1 full year of Bill's service still in the California Senate, I'm starting to already feel nostalgic, and you may all be feeling that way too. It was when Bill was elected to the Assembly in 2008 that I had sort of a newfound belief in our democracy, because I had known Bill at the Middlebury Institute, which was the Monterey Institute at the time. And I thought to myself that if we can elect a representative with his skills in conflict resolution and negotiation, then we can really tackle some of the greatest challenges of our time. And he has done just that, whether it's climate change work, access for all to safe and clean drinking water, or what we heard about 2 years ago was the unbelievable effort to pass the California End-of-Life Option Act. So, Bill, you've made us so proud every step of the way. Please welcome me and join me in welcoming.
Well, thank you, Kate, and thanks to all of the Democratic women of Monterey County. Appreciate your work and leadership every day. I want to also thank your Vice President, Nicole Hollingsworth, who moonlights working with my office and providing connective tissue between all of you and our work in Sacramento. I want to start by asking you all, let's thank our servers today with hotel employees and restaurant. And we should always make clear to the hotel, that's why we're here, is because of their union contract. I also want to acknowledge with us today is my good friend Phil Butler, who's going to be honored with the Human Rights Award of the United Nations Association on December 7th. Phil, congratulations, brother. And I hope many of you will be able to attend that, hosted by the United Nations Association and the Baha'i Faith. Also, I'm glad to see that today coincides with former Secretary, former Assembly Member John Laird announcing my endorsement of John for his election to my seat in 2020. So I hope you'll all join in that endorsement. but as I've jokingly been telling people, rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated. I do have a full another year of service in Sacramento, and working with Mark, hope that we can do some good and cause some mischief at the same time. So I thought I would lead with just a real brief overview of what we've been doing in Sacramento and this year's budget, and then focus in on some of the efforts affecting this region in this district. I also want to just lead, there was an announcement yesterday by Governor Newsom and by the Agency of Resources and the Department of Conservation declaring a moratorium on any new permitting for fracking. And if you look at the decision, it not only creates a moratorium on any new permits for fracking, but it also will convene a rulemaking body to look at the operation of all underground well operations. I guess by definition, well operations are underground, but particularly the use of injection. I was a proud co-author with Fran Pavley of Senate Bill 4 that requires all oil companies that are engaged in oil extraction in California to share with us the recipe of chemicals that they're injecting into the ground. They had argued that it was proprietary, trade secret, and our Senate Bill 4 now makes all of that information available to our public health officers and to the public. This affects Monterey County. It also affects San Luis Obispo County. It affects the entire state, but some of the precipitating events for Governor Newsom have been huge oil spills, they're called, even though they're overflow from injection sites in Kern County. 1.3 million gallons of oil that's flooded a creek bed, a dry creek bed. The oil producers say, well, it's a dry creek bed, it's not contaminating any water. Part of the order from day before yesterday will convene new rulemaking, with the priority being public health and safety in the design and evolution of any permitting moving down the road. And that while it's a moratorium that's been announced, the governor said it doesn't rule out a total ban based on the investigations that will be set in motion. So this is a tribute to the many activists around the state who have continued to push for a ban on fracking. As you know, we passed Measure Z here in Monterey County. It's tied up in the courts. A Measure G in San Luis Obispo County fell short in 2018, but now San Luis Obispo County will also benefit from these protections. So I thank all of those who have been supporters of Measure Z here in Monterey County. The other element of the governor's statement on this is the priority in light of climate change of reducing our dependence on fossil fuels and meeting our renewable energy targets and exceeding them and moving to a non-carbon dependent energy economy in the state of California. So the two are linked. We passed an on-time budget, I think the 10th budget cycle in a row, representing also our 10th year of a recovering economy, meaning that we've generated more each year. But as many point out, if you look retrospectively, we've never had an economic growth recovery from a recession that lasted more than 7 years. We're now 10 years out. So a lot of the forecasters, including the Legislative Analyst's Office, just this week are forecasting some protective measures to protect against an offset. One of the things that we did with the Assembly and the Senate, we have a rainy day fund that now has close to $19 billion in it that can only be accessed by the declaration of a state emergency by the governor. But we also have established a safety net reserve for programs that are dependent on state budget, but when we have a decline in our economy is when unemployment goes up demand on safety net programs, social services programs go up as well when we don't have the money. So we're putting away, when we have surpluses, money into this social services safety net rainy day fund as well, which again was started under Governor Brown and continued by Governor Newsom. One of the big winners in the budget was our public education, K through 12. There's never enough, but of that $215 billion budget, $103 billion into K through 12, and then $44 billion in special funds. We're up to our highest per pupil average daily attendance calculation, $17,423 per student per year in our public education system. It still falls short of where we need to be, but it's moving us in the right direction. And I'll just make a political announcement here. On the March ballot, we've placed the Assembly and the Senate, and supported by the Governor, a public school bond measure of $15 billion. It'll be on the March ballot, where when we place a measure, we can pick the ballot, so it won't be as competitive as the November ballot. It would put $2 billion into UC, $2 billion to CSU, $2 billion to our community colleges, and the remainder, about $9 billion, to K through 12, new construction and modernization. So most of that investment will be in infrastructure for our students, our teachers, and classified employees. I'm going to touch on PG&E bankruptcy because it affects our area, as do the shutdowns. I sat in on a Senate Energy Committee hearing this past Monday, and we had the three directors of Southern California Edison, San Diego Gas and Electric, and PG&E. And as you can imagine, having the PG&E CEO up there sucked a lot of the oxygen out of the room. I'm sorry to say, but perhaps not surprising, he seemed the least equipped of those three energy entities. And he kept, his mantra was kind of, well, I've only been here for 6 months. We have a lot to do. You know, they're always careful in a public forum not to admit guilt or liability, but they're looking at about $30 billion in liability. Some of the things we've been doing under Governor Newsom's leadership, we've required establishment of an emergency fund paid into with not ratepayer money, but shareholder money from the three entities of $21 billion to protect victims of their malfeasance and injuries. Mark might want to fill in some more on that, and we've been monitoring the shutdowns. They've affected our areas. Fortunately, we haven't faced any evacuations this fall in our district. Northern California has been hit by fires, as has Southern California. And as Governor Brown called the new abnormal, we are playing catch up, and again, the nexus with climate change is critical. The unprecedented high level of winds, the dryness, the fire conditions are unprecedented. And we now have basically a 365-day-a-year firefighting response through CAL FIRE. We did raise budget amounts to CAL FIRE, new aircraft, more trucks on the ground, and more full-time troops on the ground. But we're seeing, as we do with veterans coming back from war zones, a higher rate of PTSD and an increase in suicides of firefighters. Deployed to these front lines for weeks, months at a time, away from their families, working 24-hour shifts, 24 hours on, some sleep, and then back again. And our office has been receiving reports of some people who have been denied insurance coverage. And if you fit to that category, please let Nicole know, call our office, because we are keeping a record in my district of location of the insured and the company. And again, we can't force private sector insurance companies to extend insurance, but in Colorado they have created a ranking system for premium deductions and premium awards based on people that have fortified their homes. On the environmental front, perhaps my biggest success, and perhaps the biggest success since I've been in the legislature, was the governor's support and signing of our Senate Bill 200. This brought clean, safe drinking water reform. My bill established the fund that will allocate $130 million a year for 10 years, actually about $1.4 billion, to remediate water systems of contaminated water affecting about 1 million Californians. And while most people, when you mention Flint, Michigan, know about lead contamination in the water, many Californians don't know that we have this public health crisis. The common denominator in these water districts, it's poverty, and they're small districts. They can't raise the money necessary, and we do have some of these systems in Monterey County, Santa Cruz County, who will be eligible to apply for support from this fund. I met with the relatively new director of our state water board, Joaquin Esquivel, the other day, and they are well on the path to implementation, establishing a statewide advisory board. 95% of this money will go to target remediation. It can be emergency water, it can be consolidating systems, a safe system to an unsafe system, or it can be capital or operations and maintenance support. So this was a huge achievement. We had a coalition of over 90 organizations and bipartisan support in our final ramping up in the Senate and the Assembly. Governor Newsom mentioned his support for this effort in his inaugural speech, in his first State of the State, and when he introduced his first budget. And then the first partner, Jennifer, at an event we have every year honoring women from our districts, women leaders, she was talking about the contributions of women, and she talked about the importance of passing the Clean, Safe Drinking Water Bill. So having them on our side certainly helped. But I want to thank everyone in this room who was also supportive as we went along, including the Monterey County Board of Supervisors. Mary Adams, thank you, and your colleagues for your support as well. Let me just wrap up. We'll get Mark up here, and I'll be welcome any of your questions. I don't want to close on a tragedy, but I am going to mention the shooting at Gilroy because that's in my district. One of my staff people, Colleen, was there at the time of the shooting, had to flee the shooting as it was happening. We've been working with the city of Gilroy. As you recall, 3 young people were killed, a 6-year-old, a 12-year-old, and a 25-year-old who was engaged to be married and was there with his fiancée, a constituent from Santa Cruz, and then about 8 others that were wounded and are in various stages of recovery. That was at the Gilroy Garlic Festival. Controlled entrance, wanding, checking handbags, and the culprit, a 19-year-old, cut through a fence. He bought the weapon, an AR-15 replica in Nevada, legally. He could not have bought that weapon in the state of California. If we had uniform gun regulation laws nationally, not only would he be prohibited from buying that weapon in California, he wouldn't have been able to get it in the state of Nevada. The cycle of these tragedies continues, and everyone thinks it's always happening somewhere else. Well, it can and does happen anywhere, and I think anyone who seeks to represent this state in Sacramento or in Washington, D.C. should be taking a pledge to make our streets safe. We've lost more children in schools this year than we've lost soldiers in combat. It's a pretty sobering thought. And I see Esther Malkin here. I just want to also, we had a good meeting this morning talking about renters and the crisis of housing. Mark, I'm sure we'll talk more about housing. I have a bunch of notes on housing, but maybe I'll wait for questions. Renter relief is one way we try to close the gap of unaffordable housing for workforce in our region. Throughout my district, all the coastal communities, Santa Cruz down to San Luis Obispo, when I meet with school districts, when I meet with law enforcement, when I meet with professional associations, their number one issue is recruitment and retention. The housing is too expensive. They can't get professionals, and yet we can't provide housing for workforce and students because of the exorbitant costs. So we were able to pass the rent cap with the support of Governor Newsom this year. Supported both of our houses. It was pretty much of a partisan vote, but it puts a cap on increases in rent and instills due process rights before any tenant can be evicted. It can only be with just cause. It can't be based on the whim of a property owner. So we'll talk more about that. I'll be working with Marcus in our budget year next year, looking at different options of how we can build on that to provide greater economic relief for renters, which ultimately helps the employers and even the rental property owners. They need to get on the bandwagon. It's better to have a stable source of revenue and a stable workforce than not. So I'll look forward to your questions after Mark's presentation. But again, thank you all for being here and for all you do.
So Assemblymember Mark Stone is in his fourth term. His district includes portions of Monterey, Santa Cruz, and Santa Clara counties. And like I mentioned before, he's a legislator that's always looking out for us, and it would be really wonderful if that was what we saw across the board. Whether it's the values that we place on protecting the environment or protecting California's most vulnerable communities, Mark is in Sacramento fighting on our behalf and for everything that we hold dear. And in a representative democracy, Mark is, I think, the best example that we have. Our values and our vision for this area and for Monterey County are always what I believe Mark is thinking about. And plus, I don't know if it was intentional or not, but I think he was the reason why we have the coolest hashtag of 2019, which is hashtag Who Needs Desal. So thank you, Mark, for that and for all you do. And maybe go for
I just want to Bill had a chance to talk about sort of where we've been. I think I want to look at a couple of initiatives that have gone through the legislature that are looking ahead, and then maybe that'll spur some questions, and then we can get some questions. But one of the things that I just want to point out, because I know a lot of you have had this conversation, have been watching the media, what's happening back east with the hearings. And in the House Intelligence, let's underscore intelligence, committee that's there, if you think back to when the, sort of before Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House and who chaired that committee, and you watch them act now and ask questions, you begs the intelligence question, and watch how Adam Schiff runs it. Such a remarkable difference in who's running things versus who had been running things before, and the willingness to get to the truth and find things out. So it's frustrating, I know, to watch and to listen to some of the nonsense that goes on there, but as a civics lesson, to start to understand governance, that discrepancy between the previous chair of the House Intelligence Committee and the current chair of the House Intelligence Committee says lots and lots and lots. So I think I want to touch briefly on a few areas that are of interest to you, I know. And first, in the education space, there will be in March an education law that is coming forward, and it is $15 billion. And the title of it, at least for the section that is for K-12, it also says preschool, K-12, and all. But I don't think much of it's going to get spent on preschool. And I think this is an issue that you'll understand. There were a number of us who went to the governor and said there's no money for preschool in that bond. And there really isn't. We were trying to get a carve out for preschool, because if we don't have that carve out, it's not necessarily going to be spent there. So what they did was they changed the K-12, K-14 actually, to be preschool and K-14. But since it's been such a long time since we have put bond money for facilities for the school systems, every school district has a long list of projects that they want to get done. Those will get done first. So even though preschool is in the title, there's no, in my view, no money for preschool. And that's a real challenge, because if we want to open up slots, and if we want to ensure that we have universal preschool throughout California, we need to do two things. We need to fund facilities for preschool, and we need to increase the rates. So we are working in this next year's budget on increasing the rates to do that piece of it. And there were about 20 of us in the assembly, in the governor's office, saying this is entirely unacceptable if we are not going to have a piece of this big bond be for preschool, that we want your commitment for at least $600 million out of the next year's budget. And he says, oh, I can't promise anything in next year's budget. Yeah, well, we will be adding that in our budget, and hopefully we'll get champions in the Senate too, not to put pressure on you, but we'll be working through Holly Mitchell, Bill, and others, because we know they value preschool. If we can't put money on the table now, then we're going to be even further behind in our ability to deliver preschool across California as we try and implement it. So that's actually one of the challenges that we have, is in a way completing the picture. And I love being able to talk about these things here with you, because you, I know, understand it. You have those values. And these are things that we struggle with. And Bill's coup about bringing the safe and affordable drinking water forward was monumental for the state of California. But understand how we're funding that. We had on the table something that we wanted to do, and it was appropriate to have those who have been contributing to the poor water actually fund that. And what happened in the end was the governor and a few others took the easy way out and went to greenhouse gas reduction. Now, what does greenhouse gas reduction money have to do with the safe, clean drinking water? There's a climate nexus, but in the end, really nothing. It was just an easy place to go. So that means less money available for the purposes that the cap and trade dollars were intended, because that was just an easy place to go fund this thing. So we have a program in place which is incredibly important, and I can't underscore enough how Bill's ability to maneuver within the legislature and the administration, how key that was to getting this done. But we're going to be struggling with the funding piece of that for a long time. And it's right now inappropriately done. So we'll keep our eye on that, because we are going to have a lot of work ahead of us to deal with changing climate and all of those impacts. There has been talk about, and we will see this coming out, a resilience bond that we're going to be looking to try to put on the ballot. And the issue that I have no problem with raising money in another bond to build resilience in California, because this is trillions of dollars of need that we're going to build. The problem that I have with the way that it's constructed, again, like the schools, that if we just put another bond on the ballot and move that forward, and that looks like that's where we're heading, fine, but all of the local jurisdictions and agencies and various water districts and pollution control districts and all have this long list again of capital needs that they're going to spend that money on. So there's no guarantee that if we build a bond and sell it to voters based on the resilience question, the need to build climate adaptation into our policies across California, and especially we'll see this acutely in the coastal area because of sea level rise, change in ocean chemistry, and the number of effects that are happening. If we don't build in the ability to put some money on the table for local jurisdictions to do the planning necessary, to do the regional collaborations necessary, then we're just going to be funding the projects that are currently in the pipeline, and no guarantee that we will be building that resilience that we need for California. So that's a missing piece in that bond, just like the preschool is a missing piece in the education facilities bond. So these are pieces that I think we need to keep track of and be very aware of. We have not been successful in putting any money on the table for local jurisdictions, flexible money that they can use for planning, that we can use for monitoring. I sit on the Ocean Protection Council, and this has been, fortunately, we built some of these values into the strategic plan that we're working on for the Ocean Protection Council, and trying to create a venue where we can bring all of the other state agencies in, and ideally local jurisdictions in, to have broader conversations about what the need is, what the planning gaps are, and how we ensure that we're moving in the right direction and investing in California in next steps to build that resilience. We've done a decent job with mitigating. We have a long way to go with mitigating the changes to the climate and greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, but what we have not addressed really as a state, and partly because it's very hard politically and very hard financially to deal with, adapting to the changes that are coming. And I also want to talk briefly about the housing piece. We did a lot this last year, but if you look at some of the details, you'll find that it's a bit lacking. Most legislation is a negotiation. Most legislation is a set of compromise. And what environmental activists have said for decades is every time we compromise, the environment loses. And to a large extent, that's been true. Well, the rental protections that we put on the table were highly negotiated. And we are, in fact, not going to be reaching all of the renters we would have hoped. And a piece of it that we weren't able to do is protecting renters against increases now before it takes effect. So a lot of local jurisdictions are appropriately putting those in place temporarily before the state law takes effect in January. And that's a very good thing, so that landlords are not able to raise the rent, do their evictions, and we tried to address some of that in the legislation, but we're not going to. And I will also tell you that there will be, even though there was a lot that was passed this last year, there will continue to be quite a bit moving forward this next year around housing. We have put aside billions of dollars in the state budget this year for housing and dealing with homelessness, and those are good things. What we haven't been exactly clear on are the criteria of how that money gets spent and how we can help local jurisdictions. Since we've robbed local jurisdictions, we, in California, Prop 13 and a number of other measures, really made it impossible for local agencies to raise the revenue to solve the problems we expect them to solve. A lot of that's going to have to come from the state. And Newsom, when he was inaugurated in housing and homelessness, talked about carrots and sticks. Well, we've passed in the legislature some of the sticks, but not always the carrots. And I think we need to do that and be responsive to local jurisdictions to get them the help they need to get us out of the housing crisis that we're facing, the homelessness crisis that we're facing. So those are some of the things that to look forward to over this next year, to see how they develop as we're working on legislative policy, especially around the budget. The Legislative Analyst Office just came out there predicting a $7 billion surplus next year, or this current year, added to what we currently have. So that means a couple of things, that there is that money that is being put away for the next economic downturn, and we can kind of smooth out the implications that we will cause on local jurisdictions, cities and counties. Since around the 2008, 6, 7, 8, 9, when the state was cutting programs significantly, it were the local jurisdictions that felt that most acutely. That I'm hoping we cannot do next time because we will have those reserves. But it also means that there is some money available for one-time things like preschool facilities funding and others that the state can be investing in, and with an eye to the future of being able to help manage some very expensive things downstream that we can afford to do now. So those are the conversations that we're having around the budget, and we'll see how that plays out. I will just also end on a note that it was an interesting year from a transition standpoint because we had a brand new administration governor. And this governor, who has done some great things and wants to do some very, very big things, and that's a good thing for the state of California, has also struggled a little bit with some of the deals he made with the legislature, and then in the end said, oh, that's not quite right, I want to do more. And we're thinking, wait, what? You just passed what you wanted, and now you want something different? Oh, Lord. Yeah, so they're learning. They've got their process. They still don't quite understand what our processes are, and our timelines, not necessarily that any of us do. The legislature is a unique animal. So they have to kind of learn how better to work with us. And whereas Jerry Brown was very happy to say, here's what I want to do, and here's how we're going to do it, Newsom's a little bit different. He'll say, here's what I want to do, how do you think we should do it? And the legislature, being used to Jerry Brown, saying, yeah, okay, and working hard to negotiate around the edges, doesn't always know what to do with that grant. And we're not always equipped necessarily to do that. We're 120 very individuals and don't always come with the expertise to be able to solve those problems. So that's what we're working with the administration and trying to get some of the policies figured out. He has expanded his staff, especially his legislative staff and other teams he has from what Jerry Brown did. So I think Jerry had a pretty firm thumb on all of his people. Newsom has put some absolutely incredible people in all of the right spots and done some really phenomenal things for California. We now have a state surgeon general. And, oh, by the way, a surgeon general who understands in depth what adverse childhood experiences are and all of those impacts, both societally, socially, and economically, that we need to deal with. So I think from an early childhood education standpoint, preschool standpoint, well, a lot of the things that we need to do to build stronger communities, stronger families, we have an administration poised to be able to do that. Let's just see how we ultimately get that. So thank you for your time. Very happy to be here. I think Bill and I'm going to drag him up here, so I'm not going to stand out here. So what can we answer for you?
Yeah, I sent a report to both of your offices earlier this year, a few months ago, on smart meter electrical and fire hazards. This report is also on my website, smartmeterharm.org. Some of these problems were picked up by IBEW in Texas a number of years ago. And PG&E power shutoffs are causing additional impact in relation to this because the smart meters can malfunction due to surges. So this is a huge problem, a public safety problem that the public's not being alerted to. Another report on my website has problems of smart meters in general that I compiled for San Francisco Bay legislators in 2012. And these issues are not being addressed by the state. In addition, the state has been sort of in a position of pushing 5G despite the impacts to insects that scientists and medical people are warning about, as well as to the most vulnerable. So you have environmental
So
and
Nina, what would
vulnerable
you like them to
populations.
answer for you?
I would like them to tell me what actions they're planning to do to have hearings with stakeholders who have been alerting the state to these issues for many, many years, and to ideally halt 5G in California until we have a better idea of the environmental and health impacts, as well as deal with those of us, thousands of people in California who are electromagnetically sensitive, a growing problem recognized by the federal government, given accommodation by the legislature, but not
So there are basically two questions in there. One with respect to fire hazards, PG&E infrastructure, and smart meters. And then the second having really to do with 5G and implementation, which at this point I'm less sure about, so I'm going to have to look into that. Bill mentioned it briefly, and I'll start this and you can step in. I come to think of PG&E these days as FPG&E. And I'll leave it to your imagination what the first letter stands for. But they have, before we actually get to the issue around smart meters and individualized risks at homes, we have a major problem with the broader infrastructure. And if you look at what other investor-owned utilities have done over the last 10, 15 years, after the fires in San Diego Gas and Electric, every time I talk about this, my colleagues from the San Diego area think that I'm absolutely crazy because they don't like SDG&E either. But what they did was they did, oh my gosh, risk assessments. And they started to harden their infrastructure by insulating wires and putting in systems that do fast switching, ground fault interrupted systems that do some fast switching, so that if there is a fault in the system, it is less likely to lead to wildfires. They've been doing these kind of shutoffs for years. And most people think, oh, I didn't know that. Yeah. Why didn't we know that? Because it's been strategic, it's been surgical. PG&E does blackouts throughout most of its entire service area, so they're not very thoughtful, not very smart about it. And they shut down before they need to, and they restore long after they really should be. So what's happening?
there are a number of initiatives right now going on, and some of this is tied up with the bankruptcy court. So whether we municipalize the entire system, which there's a bill for, although there's not a lot of detail in it, or create some kind of a customer-owned, ratepayer-owned cooperative, which is what there's a long list of mayors who have signed on to this, there are options for us to be able to take more public control over the distribution system, which I think is absolutely the right answer. So there are hearings being held. The Senate just had one. I've been talking to a number of my colleagues. We're going to be looking this year at how we take broader control over that system that has shown to be inadequately governed, and really ridiculous decisions have been coming out of them. And for that president of PG&E, who's only been there 6 or 8 months, when you look at what he's getting paid, that should be an embarrassing statement for him to have made when he is supposed to be turning this company over. And, oh, by the way, they have been, instead of doing a risk assessment, instead of doing infrastructure improvements, what have they been doing? They've been paying their shareholders. And they have been, the last time they were in bankruptcy, they paid out $168 billion in bonuses to their executives before they were even out of bankruptcy. Well, we just passed a law that they can't do that. So there's a lot that's happening. We try to control, what we don't know yet is what exactly those next steps are. That's going to take the governor and the legislature working pretty closely together.
Because I think I know part of the question, and I just want to recap it. Is there any health impacts that we should be aware of, or that you have concerns about, in terms of the increase in 5G, the cell towers, the smart meters? I mean, is there an electromagnetic concern that you've heard about or that we should be thinking about?
So we've definitely heard about it, and your question included at least 3 different possible exposure concerns. The smart meter installation, when I was in the assembly, we received a lot of data from both sides and monitored implementation and follow-up. One of my concerns in any of these areas is PG&E is a non-responsible purveyor of a utility. I've always felt that the necessities of life, power, water, should be in the public domain. They shouldn't be forced. When you look at PG&E right now with $30 billion of liability at least, and people say, well, the state should just take it over, run it as a public utility. Well, that sounds great, public utility. The $30 billion of liability, we can't stiff the people that have been victims. And if we take on $30 billion of liability, do we take that from public education, from healthcare, from environmental programs? It's not, you don't wipe the slate clean and say, now we'll try to operate this utility. So in the bankruptcy is where we are being represented. We are getting regular briefings. At the hearing we had Monday, one of the members of our committee said, PG&E's had 3 strikes and they should be out of the business. The first strike, killing people at San Bruno. The second strike, killing people in the fires of 17 and 18. And the third strike is the mismanagement of the power shutdowns this time around. Mark alluded to San Diego, Gas and Electric. They have proactively invested in being able to do shutdowns that are more micro-focused in times of fire threat or crisis, insulating lines. I've heard from constituents, Big Sur, Carmel Highlands, why don't we underground the lines? That would be a safety measure. The resistance to that has always been the cost of undergrounding, but I made a statement in the hearing the other day. I did some quick back-of-the-envelope math. They face $30 billion in liability. If they had undergrounded 1/4 of their lines at $1 million a mile, although they say now it's more like $3 to $5 million a mile, but I use the $1 million figure for sake of my math. For $15 billion, they could have undergrounded 1/4 of their lines. The nomenclature is important because there's delivery lines and transmission lines, and some, because of their high kilowatt voltage, can't be undergrounded. But when we look at Carmel Highlands or Big Sur Coast throughout my district, Santa Cruz Mountains, fire-prone areas, it should be moved up to be a priority. And as part of the reorganization of PG&E, I would hope that that would be one of the mandates before further shareholder profits or bonuses, you invest in public safety. So our number one mantra, and we'll go to the 5G question as well as we look at it in the legislature, the number one mantra is public safety, followed by reliability of service. I also have Diablo Canyon in my district. We've been in the lead of the decommissioning of an unsafe nuclear power plant, and it's a little sobering to think the same people that killed people in San Bruno in Northern California are charged with the safe operation of a nuclear power plant. So I secured mitigation offset for the workers to keep them there, to keep skilled workers working there until decommissioning. Because if you're told your job ends in 7 years, what do? You look for another nuclear plant in another state, take your skill set there. So we got a bonus enhancement to keep workers working there who have the skills as we decommission that plant. One of Mark's counterparts in the Assembly, who overlaps my district in San Luis Obispo County, Assemblymember Jordan Cunningham, he wants to sell Diablo to keep it running as a nuclear plant, arguing that it's safe, clean energy. And I asked him, well, wait, what about the spent rods? And do you want to return the money that we got for the people of San Luis Obispo County? Because that was based on the agreement to decommission the plant. So he's promised to introduce legislation to keep Diablo running and to produce clean energy without any explanation what you do with the spent rods, which are on site and are going to stay there. There's no place to send them. And that's the special risk that people take there. A little bit of a diversion from the question, but it'll be on our radar. I appreciate your work and being here today. Do you want to help pick Peter?
Could you please
We
answer
do
the
want to hear some
question?
other
No,
questions.
I haven't gotten any answer to my question, and you haven't responded to any information that I sent to your
Other
office.
people here to speak.
Go ahead, here.
I want to thank you both for supporting not going with the desal plant, and especially the letter from Senator Monning. Many of us have worked this issue for a long time, and we were hoping that the Coastal Commission was going to finally be our hurrah. My question to you is, what is going to happen now with the PUC coming in and doing what they're doing? You know what I'm saying is there going to be an effect from that organization coming into the Coastal Commission trying to do whatever they're trying to do?
Fair question. Thank you for your question. Credit where's credit due. It was Assemblymember Stone's letter to the Coastal Commission. I don't do letters to the Coastal Commission or any appointed agency. I will report to you all, and I've shared this with those who are active. I have talked with the Executive Director, Jack Ainsworth, a couple months ago now, making sure that the staff review would include looking at all alternate options. I got that assurance from him on a phone call. I've seen the staff report. Its decision recommending against the approval is based in large measure on the conclusion that there are safer environmentally and less expensive alternatives. So that's what's in front of the Coastal Commission. To your question, and Mark will have thoughts on this as well, the PUC, when it approved, also based their approval on their review of scientific material prepared by their staff and presented by the parties. So we have state agencies who have taken different postures vis-a-vis the efficacy and the safety of desal. So my understanding is that this delay for a vote of the Coastal Commission is to try to reconcile those differences. I can't predict where they're going to land. Mark may have some insight to that, but it's interesting where you have different state agencies and the State Water Board, which enforces the 9510 cease and desist order, which is what's prompted the pursuit of alternatives, in which in my tenure I've succeeded in getting 2 postponements of the enforcement of the 9510 order, and I feel like the Charlie Brown cartoon each year with a football and pulling it away. My assurances to the Water Board, this will really be the last time, but I think we may be back. Mark?
So I think there's a little bit of confusion about the PUC's role with respect to Coastal Commission. And I clarified this by talking to a commissioner. And sort of go back to the PUC hearing. The PUC did not have all the facts in front of it when it heard the issue about Pure Water Monterey, what they could and could not do. And that was political, because they had not really had a vote of the board yet, and they were not able to present to the PUC all of the information that was there. And so when explaining that to some of the commissioners, they still stand by their decision, they made their decision, but they were a little disappointed that they didn't have all of the facts. Well, that was one of the things that was very important in getting the Coastal Commission to understand what the numbers were from Pure Water Monterey, and Pure Water Monterey was then able to get that information forward. But now the PUC, and I went back to check with the PUC about this, they were providing information only. They are neutral as to the Coastal Commission's decision. They are not trying to influence it. They are just trying to provide some information. And part of this is because they now can see what other information is out there. That's not going to change what they did, because they can't go back and change that. But they are going to let the Coastal Commission make its own decision. But Coastal was feeling a little bit out on its own when the PUC had its decision, and the Water Board, the Water Agency, has been pushing back on what the Coastal Commission was effectively trying to do. But if you read through that staff report, they came to that conclusion really on their own, based on the Coastal Act, which is what they have, that's their lens, is the Coastal Act and the local coastal program that Marina has, not all of the other factors that are there. That's their lens, and so that's how they came to that conclusion. I was a little disappointed that they pushed the decision off, but part of that was really to make sure that they get the information from the other agencies and can kind of coordinate that. Although I will underscore, the PUC is not going to be is not in a position at all of trying to influence the Coastal Commission's decision, merely answering questions for them. But also, CalAm could have asked for that same ability to have the hearing that date and a decision at a later date. So that was probably inevitable anyway, unfortunately, that step that they could have taken. So I don't know, I'm with you, I don't know what to read into that. And I don't know what the commissioners themselves would have done with this. There have been heavy lobbying with the governor's office and with the commissioners, especially the governor's office appointees to the commission, because he has more direct control over them than the legislative appointees do. So that remains a risk. I think the presentation, the public comment that went on for a long time was very clear in my book about what the expectation is out of the commission, but we'll see. And fortunately, and it's been put to March, and the reason that it's been put to March is they're going to be back in the region. Now, Coastal Commission is the one agency that tries to make decisions as close to the site of the project as absolutely possible. And I know Half Moon Bay was a little bit of a travel. It'll be in Scotts Valley in March. That's a little bit of travel, but it's better than Los Angeles or Eureka or other places that the commission meets. So they are trying to make these decisions as close as possible to the area, and that's sort of the lay of the land at this point.
So we've got 3 questions that I see. We've got Sylvia, Monica, and Esther. If we can get all 3 in, we will, and if not, we'll just start with Sylvia. We'll try.
I have 2 questions to ask. The first one is that when you mentioned whether we take over the electric utilities or make it public, and the fact that they are rebuilding some of the grounding of the lines, you say it's for safety and for something. I wonder if we can put in one more element in that. Going forward, our grid is really antiquated, it's really old. Whether the state can ask the whole grid to be updated so that it's not only more modern and can also have battery capacity to welcome in the future of the solar, the wind, and that the battery to be able to operate it instead of like in olden times without refrigeration, you go to the market every day. So we need to put that in. That's a comment and a question. A second one has to do with housing. I wonder if the state could allocate some money to the county and the city so that they can build some inexpensive housing for people who are really without money. Because nowadays, we ask the developers to put down 10% here. It isn't working. And I saw in other countries, like Singapore, Hong Kong, the government come in, they build a really small but affordable housing, and there are a lot of people to buy into it. Could we do something like that?
I think that's bulky enough that that could be the last question. So, great question, Sylvia.
Let me take on your second one on housing, and then I'll conclude on the grid, and Mark will have some comments. So historically, the state government didn't involve itself in housing. It was always seen as a local issue, local land use planning, local permitting, et cetera, et cetera. Since our housing crisis has become a focal point statewide in the legislature, this legislative session that ended in September, the governor signed 23 bills into law, all related to housing, and some of that involved budget allocations of the billions of dollars to support affordable housing construction throughout the state. It sounds like a lot until you divide it among 58 counties, and then we have different sectors. We repurposed Mental Health Services Act to make $2 billion available specifically to support mentally ill homeless in the public health understanding that providing a place is the best way to then connect wraparound services of Medi-Cal eligibility, behavioral health access, medication access, get people off the street, and for dual diagnosis away from drugs and alcohol, etc. $2 billion, that was being held by the counties. We said, no, that money is supposed to go to serve the homeless. We passed legislation to repurpose that. It was challenged in the courts. The court said, no, it has to go back to the voters. 2018, the voters agreed with us, repurposed it. So that's money that will be finding its way in what we structured in that, and was in the ballot measure. So a city the size of Monterey doesn't compete with Los Angeles. It's tiered competition. So it's like-sized communities competing with like-sized communities. Because so often the big kahunas have grant writers, they have advocates, they have lobbyists. We said, no, we're going to have people on a level playing field. So as Mark said, there's always more we can do. There will be another host of both budget efforts and legislation. I think we will look closely at renter relief. You know, some people are a paycheck away from being homeless. And there are some groups that are prioritizing raising funding, including public agencies, that help a family pay rent, because it's cheaper to help them pay the rent than to have them on the street and then trying to access resources. So the priority, people who have a home, keep them there and find the resources to keep them there. Real quickly on the grid question, as we move to our renewable energy portfolio, and I sit on the California Air Resources Board, we are ahead of schedule on our renewable energy portfolio, but we're behind on vehicle emissions. And that's where we're in fights right now with the Trump administration upholding our stricter vehicle emission standards. But on the energy side, we in Monterey County are part of the CCAs, the Community Aggregated Power, with Santa Cruz, San Benito. We're now extending that to San Luis Obispo and Santa Barbara. The economies of scale in purchasing renewable energy, but it still relies on the existing infrastructure and grid. So part of the bankruptcy proceedings and part of the oversight of any utility in California is making sure that they're investing at a minimum the resources necessary to maintain and upgrade the grid for public safety, public health and safety, to reduce fire risk. I think that the fire risk issue is going to be the lead look at grid. And if the final comment, as we move forward, a lot of folks believe that we will move necessarily towards more microgrids where you have solar or wind or part of cooperative buying groups, but the actual energy generation and transmission being more localized and not dependent on huge 100-mile grid lines. But Mark?
Yeah, I just want to add a couple of things to that, and one is on the housing piece. Remember, local jurisdictions used to have redevelopment agencies, and that was a tremendous resource to be able to put into housing in those communities. That was taken away. And since that was taken away, the state has not done really very much to replace those dollars. So the $3.5 billion that we put in the budget this year, the Mental Health Services Act money, the real estate transfer fees are all attempts to start to put some of that money back into the system. That's going to be the ability for local jurisdictions to build affordable housing, because that's what that money will be used for. And then secondarily, on the grid, that because it's owned by investor-owned utilities and it's not municipal, there's only so much ultimately that we can do. And the state's not going to be able to afford to do all of that itself. But there was just a bill introduced yesterday, I think, by Anna Eshoo, Jimmy Panetta, and a number of Northern California members of Congress to modernize the grid nationwide. If we can get federal help, that's going to be the biggest infusion of ability to solve this problem. So thank Jimmy for being a part of that and for being willing to put together, for our members of Congress, willing to put together something that looks nationally. We will absolutely benefit from that.
What a great answer.